You think you can just waltz in here, old man? Look at you. You're a relic. This is a place for the future, not for whatever you are.
He was an old man in the rain, a ghost in tattered clothes. He walked into a fancy dealership, offering to fix a luxury car for a single hot meal. The salesmen laughed at his simple request, judging him on sight. But they had no idea they were about to meet a legendary mechanic. The city was a huge place of glass and steel, but to him it felt cold and uncaring. The rain came down hard, a cold, steady attack that made the streets dark and shiny. He was like a ghost in the rain, a man lost in old, torn army clothes that had long lost their color and meaning. He stood across the street, his old hands shaking. His eyes, the color of a faded summer sky, were focused on one car in the bright garage of Prestige Motors. It was an old silver Aston Martin, a symbol of a past he once knew, a machine that looked powerful and elegant. And something was wrong with it. He could hear it in the silence. He slowly walked into the fancy building, leaving a light trail of wet footprints on the shiny white floor. The air was warm, clean, and smelled of new car leather and people who looked down on others. A young man, his face perfect and smooth from a life of privilege, looked up from his phone. His smile was thin and fake and didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone making it clear he hoped the answer was no. Jack's voice was a whisper, rough from not being used much, like the sound of a rusty engine. "There's a car in the service bay," he said, pointing with a hand that shook. "The engine, it's not breathing right." The salesman, whose name tag said Kyle, blinked. "Breathing right? Sir, our mechanics are the best in the business. I think they know what they're doing." He took a small, almost invisible step forward to guide Jack back outside into the rain. Jack, however, didn't move. His eyes were still on the Aston Martin. "I'm not here to buy," he said, his voice now a low, steady tone that held a hint of strength. "I'm here to fix it." He finally looked at Kyle, and for a short moment, the young man was caught in the deepness of those eyes, a world of knowledge and sadness he couldn't possibly understand. "And all I'm asking for in return," Jack finished, "is a hot meal." Kyle stared at him for a long, shocked moment before a short, sharp laugh came out. It was a cruel sound that echoed in the huge room. He turned to his co-workers, two other salesmen who were now watching, trying not to laugh. "Hey guys, get this," he said, pointing his thumb at Jack. "This old guy says he can fix the Aston Martin for a sandwich." The other two joined in the laughter, their smirks growing bigger. Their teasing brought the owner of the dealership, Mr. Abernathy, out of his office. He was a heavy man in an expensive suit, his face showing he was worried. "What's all this noise?" Abernathy's eyes were sharp and thoughtful. Kyle pointed again, a small hand motion to show Jack should be dismissed. "This homeless guy came in off the street, says he can fix Mrs. Davenport's Aston Martin for a meal." Abernathy's worried look got deeper. Mrs. Davenport was his most important client, a woman whose name alone meant a lot of money. Her car had been in his shop for a week, and his mechanics, the best in the business, were stuck. They had tried every tool they had, replaced half the parts, and still, the engine sputtered and died. The pressure was building up. He looked at the old man, the torn clothes, the rough beard, the hands that shook with age and cold. It seemed like a crazy offer. But he had learned in a lifetime of building his business that a man who only knows success is a man who takes no chances. Abernathy was a risk-taker at heart. He had built his wealth on long shots and his gut feelings. And there was something in the old man's eyes, a quiet confidence, a flash of something long lost. "You think you can fix it?" Abernathy asked, his voice full of doubt. "I know I can," Jack replied simply. Abernathy's lips slowly curved into a smile. This was maybe the most foolish bet of his life, but what did he have to lose? "All right," he said with a flash in his eye. "You've got a deal. You fix the car, you get a meal, the best meal in town on me." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a quiet whisper. "But if you can't, You get to clean my showroom floor with a toothbrush." The salesmen laughed to themselves. Jack just nodded. Fair enough. He walked toward the service bay, his steps slow and careful. The mechanics, a team of 3 experienced workers, stopped what they were doing and stared. They had heard the noise and were not happy. Gus, the head mechanic, a big man with a permanent angry look, grumbled, "Who's this?" Abernathy gave a quick, amused wink. "He's your new helper." Gus looked Jack up and down with open disrespect. "You've got to be kidding me." Jack ignored him. He walked up to the Aston Martin, a beautiful machine even with its steel heart silent. He placed a hand on the cool metal of the hood, his eyes closing for a moment as if in prayer. The mechanics exchanged amused looks. "What's he doing?" one of them whispered. "Talking to the car gods?" Jack opened his eyes. He didn't need to look at the computer reports or the fancy tools all over the car. He had already heard everything he needed to know from the faint, uneven sound of the engine when they had tried to start it for him as he stood across the street. "It's the fuel pump," he said, his voice clear and steady. "It's not the original one. It's a newer replacement. And it's not set up right for the car's original design. The pressure is all wrong. The engine is drowning." Gus scoffed. "We've checked the fuel pump." "It's working fine." "You've checked to see if it's pumping fuel," Jack corrected him gently. "You haven't checked to see if it's pumping fuel correctly. There's a difference." He pointed to a small, almost unseen valve near the bottom of the engine. "That's a regulator valve. On this model, it's a very delicate part. Your new pump is pushing too much fuel through it too fast. The engine is getting flooded, it's choking." The mechanics looked at each other, then at the engine, then back at Jack. They had been so focused on the high-tech parts, the computers, the electronic ignition, that they had missed the simple mechanical beauty of the original design. Gus, his pride hurt, was not ready to give in. "And how would you know that?" he challenged. Jack's eyes went to a faded tattoo on his arm, a barely visible symbol of a military group that had been officially closed down many years ago. "Let's just say," he said, his voice holding a sadness that none of them could understand, "that I've spent a lot of time with old soldiers. And this car is an old soldier. It needs to be treated with respect, not just with new parts." He picked up a wrench, his hands surprisingly steady. "Now, if you'll hand me that screwdriver, the small flat one, I'll show you what I mean." For the next hour, the service bay was silent, except for the soft clinking of metal on metal. Jack worked with a quiet, focused energy. His movements were smooth and easy, each one born from a lifetime of practice. The mechanics, who had started out making fun of him, were now watching with a growing sense of awe. They were seeing a master at work, a man whose hands seemed to know what the car was thinking. When he was finished, he stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag. "Try her now." Gus, his face a mix of hope and disbelief, got into the driver's seat. He turned the key. The engine roared to life, a deep, powerful purr that shook the concrete floor. It was a sound they hadn't heard in a week, the sound of a perfectly tuned, perfectly balanced machine. Abernathy, who had been watching from a distance, walked over, his eyes wide with surprise. He looked at Jack, then at the car, then back at Jack. How did you do that?" he stuttered. Jack just smiled, a faint, sad smile. "I listened," he said. "That's all. I just listened to what she had to say." Abernathy led Jack into his office. It was a room meant to impress, with a large wooden desk, leather chairs, and walls with pictures of Abernathy shaking hands with small-time celebrities. But Jack was not impressed. He had stood in rooms where the future of nations was decided. This was just a room. "I don't know who you are," Abernathy said, motioning for Jack to sit. "But you are a genius, a total genius." He walked around his desk, his eyes shining with a new kind of greed. He wasn't just thinking about the money he would make from Mrs. Davenport. He was thinking about the money he could make from this old man. "I'm just a man who knows his way around an engine," Jack said, his voice quiet. He didn't sit. He preferred to stand. It was a habit from a lifetime of being ready for anything. "A man who knows his way around an engine," Abernathy chuckled. "My friend, you are an artist, and I am an expert on art." He leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "I have an offer for you. I'll give you a room in the back of the shop, 3 hot meals a day, and a small amount of money. In return, you work for me on the hard cars, the ones that my artists can't seem to figure out." It was more than Jack had had in years. A roof over his head, the promise of food, a reason to be. But it was also a cage. A fancy cage, but a cage just the same. He looked out the window at the rain-streaked street. He had been free for so long in his own way. Free from the expectations, the duties, the ghosts. He thought of another rainy night, a lifetime ago. He was a young man then, barely 20, standing in the mud of a foreign country. The rain was coming down in floods just like tonight. He was working on the engine of a Jeep, its metal body full of bullet holes. The engine was their only way out. Their lives depended on it, and he had fixed it. He had brought it back to life with nothing but a wrench and a prayer. He remembered the faces of the men he had saved that night, their young, scared, thankful faces. He had been a hero then, a legend. But legends, like old soldiers, fade away. He had come home from the war, a different man. The world he had fought for seemed to have no place for him. He tried to settle down, got a job at a garage, married a good woman, had a daughter. But the ghosts of the past were always there, hiding in the shadows. He saw them in the flash of a camera, heard them in the loud sound of a car. He started to drink to forget, but the drinking only made the ghosts louder. His wife left him, took their daughter with her. He didn't blame her. He had become a ghost himself. He drifted from town to town, from job to job, always running from something he could never escape. The open road became his only home, the rumble of an engine, his only friend. He was a master of his job, but a failure at everything else. He was brought back to the present by the sound of Abernathy clearing his throat. The dealership owner was looking at him, a flicker of impatience in his eyes. "So, what do you say, Jack? Do we have a deal?" Jack looked at his hands. They were old hands, scarred and rough, but they were still good hands. They could still bring things back to life. Maybe it was time to bring himself back to life. "I have one condition," Jack said. Abernathy raised an eyebrow. "Oh? I don't want a salary," Jack said. "I just want the room, the meals, and a car." Abernathy laughed. "A car? My dear man, you can have your pick of the lot once you've proven your worth." "Not one of these," Jack said, pointing to the sleek modern cars in the showroom. "I want something old, something broken, something that everyone else has given up on." Abernathy was interested. "And why would you want a piece of junk like that?" "Because," Jack said, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time, "I believe that everything and everyone deserves a second chance." Abernathy stroked his chin, a slow, thoughtful smile spreading across his face. This old man wasn't just a mechanic. He was a thinker, a showman. He could be the new face of Prestige Motors, the wise old master who could fix the unfixable. It was a perfect plan for advertising. "You've got a deal, Jack," Abernathy said, extending his hand. "Welcome to the family." Jack took his hand. The grip was firm but cold. Jack knew he was making a deal with the devil. But he had been in a bad place before, and he had always found a way out. The next few weeks passed quickly. Jack was given a small room without a window in the back of the service bay. It wasn't much, but it was warm and dry. He was given 3 meals a day from a nearby diner. The food was greasy, but it was hot. And he was given a car, a rusted, dented, forgotten shell of a 1969 Ford Mustang that had been sitting in the back of the lot for years. Everyone thought Abernathy was crazy, but Abernathy knew what he was doing. Jack became a local legend. People would come from all over the city to see the old man who could talk to engines. They would bring him their hopeless cases, their cars that had been declared dead by every other mechanic in town. And Jack, with his quiet wisdom and his magic hands, would bring them back to life. He never used fancy equipment. He just listened. He listened to the whispers of the engine, the groans of the transmission, the sighs of the suspension, and he understood. He was happy in his own way. He had a reason to be again. He was respected. He was home. But the ghosts were still there. They were quieter now, but they were still there. And one day, a new ghost walked into his life. A ghost from a past he thought he had buried long ago. She was a young woman, no older than his own daughter would have been. She had the same fiery red hair, the same determined chin, the same sad, knowing eyes. She was driving a beat-up pickup truck that was letting out black smoke. She walked up to him, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her jeans. "Are you Jack?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. "That's what they call me," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "They say you can fix anything. I can try." She took a deep breath. "Can you fix a broken heart?" Jack looked at her for a long moment. He saw the pain in her eyes, the pain he knew so well. He saw the ghost of his own daughter, the daughter he had left so many years ago. "I don't know about hearts," he said, his voice thick with a feeling he hadn't felt in years. "But I can take a look at your truck." As he worked on the truck's engine, she told him her story. Her name was Sarah. She was a journalist. She was working on a story about homeless veterans, about the men who had been forgotten by the country they had served. She had heard about him from the other homeless men in the city. They called him the Ghost, the man who had been through a lot. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know about the medals he had won, the men he had saved, the legend he had been. She just saw an old man in a greasy uniform, a man who was good with his hands. And as she talked, Jack realized that he had been given a second chance, a chance to not just fix cars, but to fix his own broken life, a chance to finally face the ghosts of his past, a chance to tell his story. The truck's engine was a mess. It was old, uncared for, and abused, just like him. But as he worked, as he replaced the old parts and cleaned the clogged-up filters, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long, long time. He was not just fixing an engine. He was healing a wound that had been getting worse for decades. When he was finished, the engine purred like a kitten. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "How did you do that?" Jack just smiled. "I listened," he said. "That's all. I just listened." She offered to pay him, but he refused. "Just tell my story," he said. "Tell the story of all the forgotten soldiers. That will be payment enough." She promised she would. And as she drove away, her truck running smoother than it had in years, Jack felt a small flicker of hope in his heart. Maybe, just maybe, this time he could finally find his way home. But the road home is never easy. And Jack's past was about to catch up with him in a way he never could have imagined. For you see, the silver Aston Martin that he had fixed on that first rainy night, it didn't just belong to any rich woman. It belonged to the wife of a retired general, a general who had known a young, smart mechanic in the war, a mechanic who went by the name of Sergeant John Jack Riley, a man who had been declared missing in action, believed to be dead for over 40 years. General Davenport was a man who believed in being exact. In his long and honored military career, every detail mattered. Every piece of information was a possible key to winning or losing. So when his wife, Eleanor, returned home, her beloved Aston Martin purring like a happy lion, he was, of course, pleased, but he was also curious. She told the story of the strange homeless man who had figured out the problem with a single touch. A man who seemed to understand the very soul of the machine. "He called himself Jack," Eleanor said, sipping her tea in the living room of their big house. "A quiet man, sad eyes. But his hands, my goodness, George, you should have seen his hands. They moved with such purpose." The name felt familiar to the general. Jack. He'd known a Jack once, a young soldier in his unit, a boy with a strange talent for mechanics. They called him the Magician because he could bring life back into the most beaten-up and broken-down engines on the battlefield. A boy named John Riley, but everyone just called him Jack. Did he have a last name? the general asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Eleanor frowned. I don't think so. Just Jack. Mr. Abernathy seemed to think it was all a big show, a bit of smart marketing on his part. He's already put the old man's face on a local billboard, the Auto Whisperer. The general stood and walked to the window, his hands behind his back. It couldn't be. Sergeant John Jack Riley had gone missing during a mission deep in enemy lands. A jeep, a flat tire, a surprise attack. There were no survivors. He was listed as missing, later declared dead. The general had written the letter to the young man's family himself. It was one of the hardest things he had ever had to do. He dismissed the thought. It was a coincidence, a trick of an old man's memory. Still, the story stayed in his mind, a piece of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. A week later, the puzzle piece fell into place. Sarah's article was published. It wasn't a big front-page story, but a quiet, personal story in the local section of the Sunday paper. The Ghost in the Machine, a veteran's second chance. She wrote about the homeless man named Jack, his quiet dignity, his almost magical ability to fix engines, and his simple wish to have the stories of forgotten soldiers told. She didn't know his last name or his past, but she captured what he was really like. She wrote about his hands, how they seemed to listen to the metal. She wrote about his eyes, how they held a world of unspoken sadness. General Davenport read the article over his morning coffee. He saw the picture that came with it, a grainy black-and-white image of Jack leaning against the rusted Mustang, his face partly hidden by shadow. But there was no mistaking the tattoo on his forearm, a faded symbol of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the general's old unit. The coffee cup shook in his hand. It was him. After all these years, alive. The world went crazy. The story was picked up by the national news. The tale of the homeless hero, the famous Sergeant Jack Riley, found working as a mechanic in a small-town dealership, was too good to pass up. It was a story of a second chance, of forgotten bravery, of the quiet strength of the human spirit. Reporters came to Prestige Motors like a swarm of insects. Cameras and microphones were shoved in Jack's face. They wanted to know everything. Where had he been? Why had he hidden for so long? What did it feel like to be a hero? Jack was overwhelmed. He was a man who had spent his life in the shadows. He had looked for a way to stay hidden, a quiet place where he could outrun his ghosts. Now the brightest lights were on him. He pulled back into himself, into the familiar comfort of the engines. He refused all interviews, speaking only through Abernathy. Abernathy, of course, was thrilled. Prestige Motors became the most famous car dealership in the country. Business boomed. He used the story for all it was worth, painting himself as the kind person who had seen the genius in the humble old man. He made the name Auto Whisperer a brand and started selling things: T-shirts, coffee mugs, even a line of car care products. Jack saw none of the money. He didn't want it. He just wanted his little room, his 3 meals a day, and the peace of his work. He continued to fix the unfixable, his hands bringing order to the mess of broken machines, even as his own life went into a new kind of mess. And then one day, she appeared. He was working on the Mustang, his safe place, carefully sanding down a patch of rust on the fender. He felt someone was there and looked up. A woman stood in the doorway of the service bay. She was in her early 40s, with the same red hair he saw in his dreams, the same determined chin, the same sad, knowing eyes as the young journalist, Sarah. But these eyes held something more. They held a lifetime of questions, a world of pain. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice shaking. Jack's hands froze. The sanding block fell to the floor with a soft thud. He had not heard that word in 40 years. He had not seen that face since it was a child's. His daughter, Elizabeth. He stood up slowly, his old bones hurting. He wanted to run to her, to hold her, to tell her he was sorry for everything. But he was frozen in place. The ghosts of his past rose up around him, their silent blame filling the air. He was a failure, a drunk, a deserter. He had abandoned her. How could he possibly ask for her forgiveness? She took a step toward him, then another. Her eyes filled with tears. "I thought you were dead," she said, her voice a mix of anger and sadness. "They told us you were dead." "I was," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. In a way, the reunion was not a happy one. It was a storm of angry feelings that were never talked about, of years of unanswered questions. Elizabeth, now a successful lawyer with a family of her own, had built a life on the fact that he was gone. His sudden return was a shock that threatened to break that life apart. She had seen the news reports, of course. She had seen the face of the man she had only known from old photographs, a man her mother had spoken of with a mix of love and bitterness, a man who was a war hero to the world, but a ghost to his own family. They talked for hours, their conversation broken by long, painful silences. He told her about the war, about the things he had seen, the things he had done. He told her about the ghosts, about the drinking, about the running. He didn't make excuses. He just told her the truth. She, in turn, told him about her life, about growing up without a father, about the empty space his absence had left in her heart, about the anger she had carried for so long. "Why?" She finally asked the one question that mattered most. "Why did you never come home?" Jack looked at his hands. The hands that could fix anything but his own broken life. "Because," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I didn't know how. I was so broken. I didn't think I could ever be whole again. I thought you were better off without me." "That wasn't your decision to make," she said, her voice cold. The words hit him harder than any bullet. He knew she was right. Their meeting ended without a clear end. She left him with a picture of his grandchildren, 2 smiling boys he had never met, and a promise to call. It was a small thing, but it was a beginning, a small line of hope in the tangled mess of his life. In the days that followed, Jack felt a change inside him. The ghosts were still there, but they were different now. They were no longer just the spirits of the men he had lost in the war. They were the ghosts of the life he had lost, the family he had left. And for the first time, he felt a small desire to not just outrun them, but to face them, to make things right. He put all his energy into the Mustang. The car became his way to admit his mistakes, his way to make up for them. Every dent he hammered out, every spot of rust he sanded away, was an act of saying he was sorry. He wasn't just fixing a car. He was trying to fix his own spirit. Abernathy, not knowing about the sadness in Jack's heart, saw only a new chance for advertising. "The reunion tour!" he shouted one morning, bursting into the service bay with a new set of plans. "We'll take the Mustang on the road. A trip across the country. Father and daughter brought back together by a classic American car. It's a story that tells itself." Jack looked at the plans, then at Abernathy's shiny, greedy face. He had been a small piece in someone else's game for so long. A piece for the army, a piece for his own drinking problem, a piece for this greedy little man. He had been a ghost, a legend, an auto-whisperer. He had been everything but himself. He crumpled the plans in his hand. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Abernathy was surprised. "No? What do you mean, no?" "This car is not for sale," Jack said, "and neither am I." He walked over to his workbench and picked up a small, nicely carved wooden box. He opened it. Inside, sitting on a piece of old velvet, was a purple heart and a Distinguished Service Cross. Medals he had never shown anyone, medals he felt he had never earned. He held them out to Abernathy. "These are for you," he said. "A down payment." Abernathy stared at the medals, his eyes wide. He knew what they were. He knew what they were worth. Not in money, but in something far more valuable. In sacrifice, in blood. "A down payment for what?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jack looked at the Mustang, its new coat of primer a dull, hopeful gray. "For my freedom," he said. "I'm buying myself back." Abernathy stared at the medals in his hand. The weight of them, both physical and meaningful, was huge. For a moment, the planned greed in his eyes was replaced by something else, a flash of respect, maybe even shame. He was a man who dealt in numbers, in how much things cost, and how much they lost value. He understood the cost of a car, a building, a man's work. But this was a price he had never learned to figure out. The cost of courage, the price of sacrifice. "What is this?" he finally managed to say, his voice softer than Jack had ever heard it. "It's a long overdue debt," Jack said. "I've been running from who I was for 40 years. I hid behind a bottle, then I hid behind these walls. You gave me a roof and a reason to be when I had nothing. I won't forget that. But you didn't save me, Mr. Abernathy. You just put me in a different kind of cage. A comfortable one, I'll admit. But I'm done with cages." "So, you're leaving?" Abernathy asked, the businessman in him coming back. He felt an immediate panic. He was losing his star, his moneymaker. "Just like that? After everything I've done for you?" "I'm not leaving," Jack corrected him. "Not yet. I'm making you a business offer, a final one." He pointed to the Mustang. "I'm going to finish this car. It will be the best machine that has ever rolled out of this shop, a masterpiece, and when it's done, it will be yours." Abernathy's eyes lit up. A car fixed by the legendary Jack Riley, the auto whisperer. The advertising alone would be worth a fortune. Collectors would be lining up. "In exchange," Jack continued, his voice steady and calm, "I want 3 things. First, you will give me the legal ownership of that old pickup truck that the journalist Sarah left here. Second, you will give me enough extra parts and tools to start a small shop of my own. Nothing fancy, just the basics. And third, you will let me go. No contracts, no advertising, no more stories. You will tell the world that the auto whisperer has retired. You can say I've gone to live with my family. You can say whatever you want, but my story from that day forward is my own." It was a brilliant move. Jack wasn't just buying his freedom. He was selling Abernathy a legend, the final amazing work of the master before he vanished into a myth. Abernathy, the smart businessman, knew the value immediately. It was a better story than any trip across the country. It had a sense of importance. It would make the Mustang priceless. "And the medals?" Abernathy asked, still holding the Purple Heart and the Distinguished Service Cross. "They are a gift," Jack said. "A reminder of what some things are truly worth." Abernathy looked from the medals to Jack's determined face. He saw a man he had deeply misunderstood. He wasn't just a broken-down mechanic. He was a general giving his own terms of surrender. And in that moment, for the first time, Abernathy felt a real sense of respect. "You've got a deal, Jack," he said, extending his hand. This time, when Jack shook it, the grip felt different. It was a deal between equals. The next month was spent with a single focus. The world outside, with its loud reporters and endless curiosity, faded away. The service bay became Jack's safe place. He worked on the Mustang with a single purpose, a quiet energy that left the other mechanics in awe. He was not just putting parts together. He was breathing life into steel. Elizabeth started to visit. At first, her visits were short and careful. She would bring him coffee and a sandwich, and they would talk awkwardly among the smell of grease and paint. She told him about her sons, his grandsons. Mark, the older one, was a quiet boy who liked to read. Luke, the younger, was full of energy, obsessed with taking things apart to see how they worked. "He's like you," she said one afternoon, a small, sad smile on her face. Jack felt a pain in his chest, a whole life he had missed, a family he didn't know. He started saving parts for his grandsons, an old carburetor he polished until it gleamed, a set of old spark plugs. He explained to Elizabeth how they worked, his hands moving with the grace of a surgeon as he pointed out the detailed parts. Through the language of the engine, he was trying to speak to a daughter he barely knew, to connect with grandsons he had never met. Slowly, the wall between them began to fall. She saw the man he was now, not just the ghost who had haunted her childhood. She saw his quiet strength, his deep, unspoken sadness. He, in turn, saw the remarkable woman she had become. strong, smart, and caring despite him. One evening, as he was putting the final touches on the Mustang's engine, she brought two small boys with her. They stood shyly behind their mother, their eyes wide with wonder at the sight of the nearly finished car. "Mark? Luke?" Elizabeth said, her voice soft. "This is your grandfather." Jack's heart stopped. He wiped his hands on a rag and knelt, his old knees protesting. He looked into their young, curious faces. He saw his own eyes looking back at him. "Hello," he said, his voice thick. Luke, the younger one, stepped forward. He pointed a small, dirty finger at the engine. "How does it do that?" he asked. "How do you make it go?" And Jack, the man who had been lost for so long, finally found his way home. He began to explain. He told them about the magic of a spark, of how a tiny spark could create a powerful sound. He spoke not of horsepower and speed, but of breath and heartbeat. He was not just teaching them about an engine, he was passing on a family history. He was fixing more than just machines. He was repairing the broken chain of his own family, one valuable, powerful link at a time. The day the Mustang was finished, it was a work of art. The body was a deep, shiny black, polished to a mirror shine. The chrome shone under the bright lights of the service bay. But the real magic was under the hood. The engine was a masterpiece of mechanical music. Every part was perfectly tuned. When Jack turned the key, it didn't roar. It sang. A low, powerful, perfect hum. Abernathy brought in a professional photographer. He had already pre-sold the car to a wealthy collector in Japan for a huge amount of money. The legend of Jack Riley's final masterpiece had already spread through the special world of high-end car collectors. Jack watched them take the pictures, a strange feeling of being apart from it all washing over him. He felt no pride of ownership. He had created it, but it did not belong to him. It was a price he had to pay, a ransom for his soul. His real treasure was standing in the doorway, Elizabeth, Mark, and Luke. After the photographer left, Jack handed the keys to Abernathy. "Our deal is done," he said. Abernathy nodded. He handed Jack a set of keys in return along with a thick envelope. "The ownership to the pickup as promised," he said, "and the deed to a small empty garage on the edge of town. Consider it a bonus for the metals." He cleared his throat, a rare moment of being real breaking through his polished outside. "Good luck, Jack." "You too, Abernathy," Jack said. He walked away from the shiny Mustang without looking back. He walked past the rows of expensive, unfeeling cars. He walked out of the bright lights of the showroom and into the soft light of the setting sun. His family was waiting for him. He had a broken-down pickup truck, a box of old tools, and a run-down garage to his name. He was, by the world's standards, a poor man. But as he looked at his daughter and his grandsons, their faces lit by the golden light of the evening, Jack Riley knew for sure, deep in his bones, that he was the richest man on earth. But freedom is a complicated thing. Jack had bought himself out of his contract with Abernathy, but he couldn't escape the legend the world had built around him. The small, empty garage he had been given was not as hidden as he had hoped. People found him, not reporters, but people who were lost, people with broken cars and broken lives, an old woman whose only connection to the world was her sputtering 20-year-old car, a young man who had spent his last dollar on a bad sports car, a single mother whose minivan had died, threatening her ability to get to her 2 jobs. They came to him not just because he was a genius mechanic, but because he was a symbol of hope. He was the man who had come back from the dead, the man who could fix the unfixable. He never charged them much. Sometimes a hot meal, sometimes a promise to help someone else. His little garage became a different kind of business. It didn't run on money. It ran on kindness. And with every engine he healed, with every life he touched, Jack felt a piece of his own broken spirit fixing itself. He was finally doing what he was always meant to do. Not for fame, not for money, but for the simple, deep happiness of making something broken whole again. Life settled into a new pattern, as steady and comforting as a well-tuned engine. Jack's garage, which he simply called Second Chance, became a quiet place on the forgotten edge of town. There was no sign, no advertising, just the occasional sight of a car being gently pushed into the bay and a day or two later driving out with a new life. People found their way there through whispers, a network of need and thanks that spread through the city's humble parts. His days were filled with the familiar routine of his job. He'd arrive at dawn, the cool morning air still smelling of dew and asphalt. His first act was always to make a pot of strong black coffee on an old hot plate, the smell mixing with the familiar scents of oil and steel. He'd stand in the open doorway, sipping the hot liquid from a thick ceramic mug, and watch the city wake up. This quiet moment of watching was a treat he had never given himself during his years on the run. It was a moment of peace, of belonging. Then he would work. The work was constant. He fixed the sputtering engine of a nursing student's old battered car, a vehicle so important she called it her four-wheel scholarship. He listened patiently as she explained her fear of it breaking down on the way to her work, and when he was done, he showed her how to check her own fluids and tire pressure, giving her a small bit of control over her worried life. He didn't just fix the car, he eased a fear. He rebuilt the transmission on a carpenter's work truck, the man's only source of money. The carpenter, a man with hands as rough as Jack's, had been quoted a price at another shop that would have put him out of business. Jack did the work for the cost of the parts and a promise of a custom-built bookshelf for his grandsons. He patiently taught a young woman, whose husband had recently and sadly died, how to check her oil and change a tire, giving her a small piece of independence in a world that had suddenly become scary and lonely. Her thanks was silent, shown through tears that Jack pretended not to see. His payment was whatever they could offer, a bag of fresh vegetables from a community garden, a still warm pie, a clumsy, heartfelt thank you card from a child with crayon drawings of cars taped to the garage wall. More often than not, it was just the quiet happiness of seeing a person drive away with one less problem to carry, their shoulders a little less bent, their face a little less full of worry. His relationship with Elizabeth grew in this new, quiet world. She would bring the boys to the garage on Saturdays. These became important days for Jack. Mark, the older one, was a thoughtful boy. He would sit quietly on a stool, reading books, occasionally looking up to ask a surprisingly smart question about science or engineering, prompted by the mechanical dance before him. "Grandpa," he'd ask, "is the rule that moves a wrench the same as the one that moves a planet?" Jack would smile and try to explain the big, beautiful mechanics of the universe in the simple terms of a nut and a bolt. But it was Luke who was Jack's shadow, his true student. The boy was a natural, his small hands having a natural interest and a natural understanding of how things fit together. Jack started him on small tasks, cleaning spark plugs until they shone, sorting nuts and bolts into old coffee cans, learning the names and uses of the tools, which he treated with a respect that made Jack happy. He taught the boy not just the mechanics of the engine, but its way of thinking. "You see this," Jack said one afternoon, holding up a greasy carburetor he was rebuilding. "People think it's just a piece of metal, a bunch of springs and parts, but it's not. It's a lung. It has to breathe just right. Not too much air, not too much fuel. It's all about creating the perfect mix, the perfect balance. Everything in life is about balance, Luke. Remember that." The boy would nod, his eyes wide with focus, a permanent smudge of grease on his nose. In those moments, Jack wasn't just a grandfather. He was a bridge to a past the boy had never known, a guide to a future full of possibilities. He was fixing more than just machines. He was repairing the broken chain of his own family, link by precious, powerful link. One cool autumn evening, as Jack was wiping down his tools, getting ready to close up the shop, a sleek black car pulled up. It stopped quietly, its quiet confidence a strong difference to the usual sputtering cars that came to his door. It was the kind of car that didn't belong in this part of town. A man in a crisp, dark suit stepped out. For a brief moment, Jack's old instincts flared up. A lifetime of running made him want to go back into the shadows, but he stood his ground, wiping his hands slowly on a rag. He was done running. The man was not a reporter or a government official. He introduced himself as General Davenport's assistant. The general, he explained, was asking for a personal visit. It wasn't an order, the aide was careful to say, but a heartfelt request from one old soldier to another. Jack agreed. The next day, he put on a clean set of work clothes, the best he had, and drove Sarah's old pickup truck to the general's big home. It was a world away from his garage, a world of neat lawns, ancient oak trees, and a quiet, impressive wealth. General Davenport was waiting for him in his study, a room filled with books, maps, and the ghosts of old military campaigns. He was weaker than Jack remembered from their brief meetings at the dealership. The sharp lines of his face had been softened by age, but his eyes were still as sharp as ever. "Sergeant Riley," the general said, rising slowly from his large leather chair. "It's good to see you." "It's just Jack now, sir," Jack replied, his voice calm. The general pointed to a chair. "Please." He didn't waste time with small talk. He was a man with a purpose, even in his sadness. "I didn't ask you here to talk about the old days, Jack. I asked you here because I have a problem, one that no amount of money or power seems to be able to solve." Jack expected him to talk about a car, a rare old model, maybe, a mechanical puzzle. But the general pointed not to the garage, but to a small silver picture frame on his desk. It was a photo of a young man in an army uniform, his smile bright and full of a life that seemed, even in the still image, endless. "My grandson," the general said, his voice thick with a sadness that was still fresh and sharp. "His name was David. He served 2 times in the latest conflict, came back, different, changed," the general explained. David had survived the war, but the war had not left him. He was haunted by the things he'd seen, the things he'd done. He couldn't connect with his family, couldn't keep a job, couldn't find peace in the quiet of his own home. He had gone into the deep silence of his own mind. "And now," the general said, his voice breaking, the carefully built wall of his military calm finally cracking, "he's gone into the garage. He has an old Jeep, one of the originals from my father's time in his war. He spends all day, every day out there, taking it apart, putting it back together over and over. He doesn't talk to us. He doesn't talk to the doctors. He just works on that engine and he can't fix it. It never starts. I think if he can't fix that Jeep, he believes he can't fix himself." The general looked at Jack, his eyes pleading, stripped of all rank and power. "They told me you can talk to engines, Jack, but I think you can do more than that. I think you understand the men who hide in them. I'm not asking you to fix the Jeep. I'm asking you to fix my grandson." It was the hardest thing anyone had ever asked of him. To willingly walk back into the heart of the storm he had spent his whole life running from. To face the very ghosts that had chased him into the wilderness of his own sadness. He looked at the photo of the young soldier, David, and he saw himself. He saw the same haunted eyes, the same desperate search for an escape in the cold, clear embrace of a machine. He had to do it. It was a debt he owed, not to the general, but to the young, broken man he used to be. The next morning, Jack went to the Davenport house. He didn't wear his mechanic's uniform. He wore simple, clean clothes. He was not there as the auto whisperer. He was there as Jack. He found David in a large, clean garage that looked more like a lab than a workshop. He was a mirror image of the photo on the desk, but the light in his eyes had gone out. He was hunched over the Jeep's engine, his hands covered in grease, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The garage was filled with parts, some neatly cleaned and laid out on cloths, others lying in piles of rusted despair. It was a scene of ordered chaos, the physical view of a troubled mind. Jack didn't say anything at first. He just stood in the doorway and watched, his senses taking in the scene. He could see the problem with the engine immediately, a cracked distributor cap, a frayed main wire. Simple fixes. But he knew this wasn't about the engine. Not really. He walked over and picked up a wrench from the floor. "Mind if I help?" he asked quietly. David didn't look up. He just shrugged, a barely noticeable movement of his shoulders. For the next few hours, they worked in a deep, unbroken silence. Jack didn't try to fix the main problem. Instead, he started on small, outside things. He began by cleaning a single spark plug, his motions slow and careful. He tightened a loose bolt on the fender. He began to organize the scattered tools, placing each one back in its proper place on a large board, creating a small island of order in the sea of chaos. He didn't offer advice. He just worked alongside the boy, a silent, steady, non-judging presence. Finally, Jack paused. He looked at the engine, then at David. "She's an old soldier," Jack said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Sometimes they get tired. Sometimes they forget why they're fighting." David stopped working, his hands hovering over the engine block. He looked at Jack for the very first time, his eyes tired and suspicious. "I knew a lot of Jeeps like this," Jack continued, his gaze distant, looking back through the years. "They'd get beat up, get shot up, blown up. We'd patch them together with whatever we had and send them back out into the fight. But sometimes the damage wasn't on the outside. It was something deep inside. A timing gear broken by a sudden shock, a main bearing worn out from stress, something you couldn't see, but you could hear it in the sound of the engine. A rattle, a knock, a hesitation. The engine, it loses its heart." He looked directly at David, his gaze steady. "It's not the broken parts that are the hardest to fix. It's the heart." A single hot tear cut a clean path through the grease on David's cheek. "I left them behind," he whispered, his voice cracked from not being used. "My friends. I left them." And then the story poured out of him, a flood of guilt and fear and unspeakable pain. A surprise attack on a dusty road, a gunfight, a split-second decision he had to make as the vehicle leader. He had survived. His friends had not. He was living with the ghosts of the men he couldn't save, their faces appearing in his dreams, their voices echoing in the silence. Jack listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He just listened, his presence a quiet anchor in the boy's storm of sadness. He had heard this story before. In the broken whispers of men in army hospitals, in the bottom of 1,000 whiskey glasses. He had lived this story, and when David was finished, his body shaking with the force of his long-overdue confession, Jack placed a firm, steady hand on his shoulder. "The war ends," Jack said, his voice filled with a lifetime of hard-won wisdom. "They tell you it's over, and you come home. But the fight, the real fight to actually come home, that's a different battle, and you don't have to fight it alone." He pointed to the cracked distributor cap. "The engine's heart is broken," he said, "but we can fix it. Together." They worked through the afternoon. Jack guided David's hands, showing him how to replace the cap, how to carefully strip and mend the frayed wire. He explained how the spark had to be timed just right, how the smallest connection, the most overlooked detail, was necessary for the whole machine to work. As they worked, Jack talked. He told David his own story, a story he had never told in its entirety to anyone but his daughter. He spoke of the men he had lost, of the crushing guilt he had carried for decades, of the long, lonely years he had spent running from himself. He showed David the scars on his soul, and in doing so, he showed him that wounds, even the deepest ones, could eventually heal. When they were done, the engine was whole again. "Try her now," Jack said. David hesitated, his fear of failure clear. Then he slid into the driver's seat. He took a deep, shaking breath and turned the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life. It was a strong, steady, powerful sound, a sound of coming back to life. David looked at Jack, his eyes filled with a light that had been put out for years. It was more than just an engine. It was hope singing in the autumn air. Jack knew his work was done. He had not fixed a Jeep. He had helped a young soldier begin the long, difficult journey home. As he walked out of the garage, General Davenport was waiting for him. The old soldier's face was a mask of deep thanks. He tried to offer Jack money, a reward, anything. Jack shook his head. "He's a good kid, General. Just listen to him. That's all he needs. Someone to listen." Jack returned to his small garage, to his quiet life. The world would never know what he had done. There would be no headlines, no awards. But Jack didn't need them. He had found something better. He had found peace. A few weeks later, a different pickup truck pulled up to his garage. It was an old, beaten-up model, but the engine purred with a smooth, confident rhythm. David stepped out. He was clean-shaven, his eyes were clear, and he stood a little taller. He was holding a small, nicely made wooden box. "I made this for you," he said, handing the box to Jack. Jack opened it. Inside, perfectly organized in custom-cut velvet, was a set of antique watchmaker's tools, each one polished to a high shine. "My other grandfather, he used to fix clocks," David said, a small, real smile touching his lips. "He told me it was all about finding the rhythm again after something made it stop. I thought you'd understand." Jack looked at the young man, at the life that was starting new before him. He saw the past and the future, the soldier he was and the man David could become. The circle was complete. That evening, as the sun set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the concrete floor of his garage, Jack was cleaning his tools. His daughter and grandsons would be there soon for dinner. The smell of Elizabeth's cooking already seemed to drift on the breeze. He heard a noise and looked up. A young man, barely a teenager, stood in the doorway. His clothes were torn, he was thin, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, familiar hunger. The boy looked at a broken-down motorcycle in the corner, a sad-looking machine with a flat tire and a tangled chain, then back at Jack. His voice was trembling, barely a whisper. "Mister," he asked, "can I fix it for a meal?" Jack looked at the boy, and for a fraction of a second, he saw himself. A ghost in a rainstorm standing outside a fancy dealership, a lifetime ago. But the man who stood in the garage now was not a ghost. He was solid, he was present, he was whole. He smiled a warm, genuine smile that reached his faded blue eyes and smoothed the tired lines on his face. He picked up a clean rag from his workbench and tossed it to the boy. "Son," he said, his voice gentle but strong, "you don't have to fix it for a meal, but you can help me fix it, and then we'll eat together."